Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me for tonight's webinar, Sensitive Caregiving for Child Development. I'm Sun Xueling, your host for tonight's webinar. Tonight's webinar is being co-organized by Child, the Center for Holistic Initiatives for Learning and Development, a research center under the Yong School of Medicine, National University of Singapore, and SunCare SG, a child and youth wellbeing focused charity. Tonight's webinar is being recorded, and we will share a link with you after the webinar is completed. Please feel free to share this with your family and friends should they be interested. I would now like to introduce to you tonight's special guest speaker. That's Dr. Cheryl Seah, who is a director at the Center for Evidence and Implementation and Adjunct Assistant Professor at Yong School of Medicine. Cheryl is a developmental psychologist and a researcher in the area of child development, disabilities, mental health, and parenting. Please feel free anytime to drop your comments, feedback on my Facebook and Instagram, also on the NUS Medicine Facebook or via Zoom Q&A. And we'll try our very best to answer your questions on parenting. Now, Cheryl, can you share with us what is sensitive caregiving?
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here with you, Ms Sun. I'm excited to share about some of the research that we've been doing about sensitive caregiving. Now, let's think a little bit in the context of a parent, a babysitter, a grandparent caring for a young child. So sensitive caregiving is when a caregiver is able to recognize and then respond to a child's cues appropriately so that the child's needs are met. Rather than reacting to their behavior in the communication, we're responding based on what we're interpreting and understanding what our children's cues are. So it does send a message to our children that they are important, their needs will be met, and we are respecting some of the temperament and some of the behaviors. So it has grown out of very early observational research on attachment a long time ago, since the 1970s. And so much of the work has been done to understand how do young children bond with their parents and what do parents do in order to build up the confidence of a young child. So I could give an example, and a sensitive caregiver would readily notice a baby trying to get your attention, whether through the hands reaching out towards the parents, whether the young baby is kicking her legs when the caregiver is approaching, or a young toddler turning her face and looking very tired in a crowded mall, and the sensitive caregiver would respond to the cue by moving to a quieter space or maybe begin to make their way home before the toddler starts to fuss. And another example, so if we have an older child who is going to school and we know they do not quite like a lot of attention, very cautious, hiding behind daddy. And the teacher was planning to meet the child by offering a very warm smile, big wave, really paying a lot of attention to the child, but understanding this child is a bit hesitant, not quite ready for all the attention. The teacher changes her response by thinking, okay, let's think about what the child enjoys. I will slowly bring something that the child likes and help the child settle in gently. And so this teacher would be very attuned to the child's needs and the temperament. And that's when we think, this caregiver is responding in a sensitive way.
Thanks for that, Dr. Cheryl. And what would be the positive outcome and impact of sensitive caregiving on a child's cognitive development as well as mental well-being?
Yeah, there has been such a large body of research and so much work done on the impact when caregivers are responding in a way that's sensitive. So a lot of the research has shown that there's so much of the impact on the children's development, their mental and healthy well-being as they develop to be very confident children. So, for example, when our young children grow up and knowing that the world around them, the caregivers around them are trustworthy, they develop very secure attachment with the adult and with the caregivers. And that gives them the confidence to explore the environment around them, to learn new things, to navigate the world around them. So they build that confidence. And secondly, having a sensitive caregiver for many months, many years of their life, it does help our young children to manage strong feelings a lot better. So they can regulate their strong emotions when they are fearful, when they're sad, when they're anxious. They develop that strong confidence and self-control, and that kind of spill into their social skills. So in times of distress, anxiety, they're more likely to find a trustworthy adult, a peer, for support and help. So then they can easily be soothed and reassured. So they're regulating their emotions a lot better. And also, thirdly, they do help with their brain development and language development, which is really exciting from just the way that we're responding to our children. We know in the early years, the brain growth is so rapid, right? And it continues all the way through early childhood. And the way that we're helping the brain grow and to develop that understanding about what I do will cause a response in other people's reactions and response to me. And they remember that and they build up some of the language skills because parents, caregivers are providing that conducive environment to help build up their brain, as well as them understanding how relationships work. So plenty of good outcomes for our young children. And when we think a little bit longer term, they establish really healthy mental health, as well as building strong relationships with their peers further down the road. So plenty of positive outcomes for our children.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Dr. Cheryl. So it sounds like sensitive caregiving for our young children helps them become confident, helps them develop emotional regulation skills, and it also helps in their brain development and language development. So lots of good stuff for our children. Now, what advice would you give to our caregivers so that they are able to develop these sensitive caregiving skills?
And it is exciting being a caregiver, right? Being a parent. I can imagine when I have children and grandparents are so keen and eager to be relating with our children, and even as they grow up as teenagers. So as caregivers, we probably already have our style in the way that we respond to young children. But as we build up that sensitivity, it's also influenced by our day-to-day. How do we feel for the day, our mental health, whether we are getting enough support from our family for us to juggle all the busy schedules that we have, and for us to be there for our children and to respond rather than to react. So it is important for any caregivers. If you want to be a sensitive caregiver, just be making sure that you're not being overwhelmed by some of the demands on your attention when you're juggling your caregiving load. Do be open to receive some of the help from your family and your friends, so you have the energy, you have the mental capacity, and the time as well to bond with your child. I think the critical part about being a sensitive caregiver, I probably would think about an acronym, like an O for observe, U for understand your child, and then to respond, which is the R. So we think about OUR, our. So you do want to take the time to observe your child, to really understand what is happening in terms of his thinking, communication, what signals they're showing to you, and then responding. So for example, after you're coming home from picking up your kids from childcare, and you notice, oh, my child seems not to obey any of my instructions. For me, asking him to take off his shoes, keep your bag, and then he starts to blow some drinks on the table, watching it overflow and then to spill, or wanting to jump on the furniture. So what's going to be my response? I'm just going to be thinking, are these cues that maybe he's overtired coming back from the childcare and he has difficulty regulating his impulses? And maybe he needs a more calming routine like a bath. And I may respond in that way, right? Or do I think about, I wonder what he's been doing all day in the school. Maybe he's been sitting quietly, paying attention to the teacher, and all that energy is bursting out at the moment. Maybe I need to do something with him and go for a run in the playground before we come back for a calming routine. So it's really about how a caregiver would be interpreting my child and then responding appropriately. And we can develop that by practice and just being very mindful and very aware of what our children have been doing, have been communicating. And then we build up that skill to be a sensitive caregiver.
Wow, thanks for that. It sounds like a sensitive caregiver has to be really quite sensitive and to pick up cues and understand the patterns of their child's behavior, because I guess children I think they behave differently from one another, and how one child behaves when he or she is tired may be different from how another child behaves when he or she is tired. And the relevant caregiver might really have to know how to recognize the patterns of their child's behavior. And that might mean that the caregiver might need to spend quite a fair bit of time in order to understand those cues. Now, I know that many Singaporean parents sometimes might feel stressed. They might feel that they are a bit tight on time. What advice would you give to Singaporean parents who might feel that they really do want to be sensitive caregivers, but they might be time-strapped or resource-constrained?
That's a really good question. I think we encounter that every day of our lives. If we think about our parents, we have full-time working parents, or we have busy parents, and now we have increased screen time. We've got Netflix, and we've got many things on our plate as well. And when we think about being a responsive caregiver, it's taking the time to check in, taking the time to observe. And if we are not mindful about that, we tend to read. So I think even when we're strapped for time, while walking our children home, while taking them out of the bus or walking from the MRT station, while changing their clothes and putting them to bed or during mealtime, those are pockets of time that we can spend with children and start to think about where my children are communicating and saying to me, when are pockets of time that I could engage and bond with my children, with telling them a story about what just happened. Asking them, whoa, what did that make you feel when your friends say that to you? So those are pockets of time that we can still respond. We can still build up that connection with our children, even during our busy time. And just that pockets of time when we're doing things, helping our children with some of the routine. I think a lot of parents especially like it when they're packing the bag for tomorrow, when they're filling up the water bottle. Those are pockets of time that we can spend with our children in a very responsive way as well. So really good quality time in that way.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Cheryl. Just a question. Anyone can be a sensitive caregiver, right? It doesn't just have to be mom or dad, can be grandparents, can be domestic helpers.
Yeah, you're right about that. So even though the research have been done quite a lot on mothers being sensitive to very young infants and then toddlers, and a lot of research has gone on to look at who are the other caregivers in our children's life as they grow up, by the time they're 6, by the time they're 10. So a lot of the research has been done as well over the past 10 years, looking at fathers, looking at grandparents, looking at our domestic helpers, looking at our childcare teachers, and thinking about how these are also very relevant for their context. So yeah, definitely. And the more caregivers around our children are responding to them adequately, timely, interpreting their cues and responding in a way that meets their needs, our children are going to grow up really strong and confident in that way and trusting all the caregivers around.
Thank you. A question that caregivers might have is, if I respond too much to my child's cues, am I spoiling them? If I were to respond to my child every time he or she cries or throws a tantrum, or even when he or she is naughty, then am I spoiling them? I think that might be a question that parents might have.
Yeah, that's a really common question because we're thinking, oh, is that a really Western way of parenting where we're responding in a way where we're giving in all the time? I think it's slightly different. I think the research has been really strong that we understand now that when an infant cries, an infant's communication is the only way, right? To cry and ask to be picked up or ask to be soothed because I'm having pain or I'm having difficulty falling asleep. So we cannot really spoil our infant by picking them up or holding them when they cry or are distressed. The faster we respond to them and soothe and comfort them, the better they are at regulating their strong emotion of distress. And that's when they're very young. And then their brain would develop and form connections based on, when I do this, there is a trustworthy adult. Now, as they grow a bit older, when we're responding to them, we're not quite spoiling them by saying, okay, they don't want to eat vegetables. They don't want to leave the playground, or they want to keep eating candies during mealtime, or not wanting to go to bed. The way that we respond to that, it's still, we respond appropriately, right? We still set the boundaries, but the way that we respond to them will not be barking instructions at them and saying, no, you can't do this. No, don't do that. But I think the way we respond could be, oh, I know you really like sugar, but we can have that tomorrow, and set a routine for them. Or, wow, I know this TV program is so exciting, but it's time for bed. And let's see what we're going to be doing as we prepare for bed. So the way that we respond to them, we acknowledge what they're thinking and feeling, and then we move them on to what is healthy and better for them. Let's explain it. Let's use short phrases to help them understand why. So that's not spoiling them in that way.
Thanks for that, Dr. Cheryl. Earlier, you talked about all the positive benefits and impact and outcomes for children if they've had a sensitive caregiver. Now, some of us might be feeling a bit guilty at this point in time and wondering whether we have truly been a sensitive caregiver when our children were much younger. Is it ever too late to start being a sensitive caregiver? Say my kids are already in primary school, or maybe even older in secondary school. Does sensitive caregiving still apply?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think for me, with teenagers in my household, being a sensitive caregiver is something that I'm still learning every day. So I wouldn't say to any caregivers and say, oh no, I think I might have done some damage, or maybe I haven't been sensitive enough. I think the idea is also thinking it's never too late. It's never too late because our young children are very resilient. Their brains are so malleable. They're developing all the time. And it changes during the early years, in the primary school years, in the teenage years. So we do have plenty of opportunities to provide our children and fill in those little palettes. So imagine our children to be a white palette, and we're filling in the colors as we engage them, as we build opportunities to bond with them. So even when we feel like, oh, maybe I have neglected my child a little bit, or maybe I've done something wrong, but it's about how much of the good things you have done in responding well to them. And we build that up and accumulate that positive experience with our children, and we build up their healthy brain. So it's never too late. Because our children are still developing, and they're going to have good relationship as well with other caregivers. So that's the ecosystem, right? Surrounding them with different adults who are responding well to them, and they build friendships. So it's never too late.
Thank you. We've got questions coming in, and actually I've got 3 questions coming through our chat that all deal with the last 2 questions you recently answered, Dr. Cheryl. The first one, since we're talking about the topic of whether it is ever too late, and who might be the sensitive caregivers or who might be the caregivers around the child. One question that has come in is, what if caregivers around me are not practicing what I'm doing? they are not responding in a high quality manner, then am I doomed in having to do the parenting and the caregiving myself? That's one question. And the second question for you to think about is, how do we tie sensitive caregiving with the concept of discipline? I'll leave that with you. Over to you, Dr. Cheryl.
Okay, yeah, really practical and really good question. I'll address the first one. So sometimes we feel maybe we have differences between our spouse or differences between my mom-in-law, let's say, right, with the way that we want to parent our children. And I would say, I think our children picks it up. Our children knows whom they're going to be relating and connecting with. So I think it's okay. I think it's having the understanding that, okay, maybe we have different ways of approaching, of correcting our children or responding to them. I'll give you an example. I think in Singapore, sometimes we see some of the caregivers reacting out of stress, right? When our children fall down. Sometimes our caregivers might say, oh no, why you fall down? See, I told you not to climb. And that's a reaction from me feeling concerned, but I give that kind of reaction to my child versus someone who goes, oh no, are you okay? And pick up the child and soothe the child, like very different reactions. And I'm thinking, when our children receive these two types of reactions, they're going to know which one is more reassuring, and they're going to be going to the caregiver who can be reassuring, and they build up that connection and strength. So I do think it's okay. I think it's also putting a good communication among all the caregivers and say, hey, this is how we think would be really positive and building good connections for our young child. Maybe we respond in this way. And it takes time. It takes time to change the way that we respond and react to our young children. So a little bit of patience, open communication. I think we can be synchronized after a while.
Just using that example that you provided, I can imagine that some parents might be thinking, but I really don't want my child to be climbing and falling down. And I may really not want to be sounding so encouraging because I might be trying to discipline my child and telling my child that climbing might be bad for you, and see, you have fallen down. So in a situation like that, and parents mean well, right, for their children. They really do not want their child to be hurt. How do they combine sensitive caregiving with setting boundaries for the child?
Yeah, so it's interlinked, isn't it? So I think it's me stepping back as a caregiver and thinking, is this the right time to be reprimanding, scolding my child? Now, I think about scolding as different from disciplining, right? When I think about disciplining my child, it's about letting my child know what is the right thing to do. This is a socially appropriate way to behave. These are some of the house rules, let's say. And if you did the wrong thing, I need to address it. And the question is when. When our child is distressed, when they're crying, they're bawling their tears out, that's probably not the right time to be instilling, this is what you should be doing. See, I told you. I don't think they're going to take it in, and they're probably going to do it again because they probably didn't hear it when you're addressing it, when they're so distressed. So I would say the discipline can come in later, especially when they're calm. And I go, hey, look, just now I did tell you not to fall, and can you tell me what happened? And we want that process of having our children think about it and think about, yeah, mommy said you cannot climb on the chairs, stack three chairs together. That's what happened, isn't it? And what should we do? So we want to empower our children to be thinking and to be able to think about what they want to do and follow some of the instructions. But that can only be learned when they're calm, not when they're stressed and crying and bawling. So I think thinking about the discipline and thinking about scolding, when that should come in, I think we should tease that apart.
Thank you. I think that was very helpful. Okay, loads of questions have come in. I think I've got 10 questions online. I'm reading them right now. I've got a couple of questions that deal with sleep training. So a question here is, does sensitive caregiving contradict infant sleep training? I think this parent might have been taught that you should ignore the child when they cry so as to teach them to self-soothe themselves to sleep.
It's a really good question. So I think there has been so much research done on this over the past 10 years. I think just thinking about what our young infants need and what is it with allowing them to be able to self-soothe. And that's the reason behind sleep training, right? For our young children, if we're comforting them, if we're holding them, rocking them to sleep, are they going to learn how to self-soothe and be able to fall asleep peacefully when it's bedtime? So that's the fundamental understanding about sleep training. Now, when we think about sleep training our young infants, and then how do I respond when my child cries? And is it time for me to come in and soothe the child? Some of the latest evidence is telling us that, yes, sleep training would work pretty well to a certain extent for some of our infants where we know we're still responding to their needs. We know to a certain extent we need to be very mindful about, are they old enough to be able to self-soothe? Are they old enough to know what to do when I cry out to my parent or my caregiver? I can trust that someone's going to come to my rescue because I'm distressed. So I think sleep training is also a combination of thinking about, is my child old enough? Does my child have some of the strategies to be able to self-soothe, to be able to hold on to something that's comforting and be able to fall asleep? And I think we need to be mindful about that and to still be a responsive caregiver, pick up our children when they've been crying for some time. I think we need to toggle that and to use that strategy, knowing the kind of temperament, the needs that our young infants have.
Thank you. There are some questions about whether or not there is a need for us to do anything differently if the child has special needs. So, for example, for children with developmental disorders, example, autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability, and they may not be able to understand the sensitive ways of communication. How does sensitive parenting look like? How do I recognize the cues of the child?
It's my passion, when we talk about children with special needs, whether very mild or very severe. So many years of working with some of our very dedicated, very patient parents and caregivers who have special needs children. Now, our understanding is also that some of our children with special needs, they may have extreme reaction or sometimes very strong reactions to some of the sensory stimulation around them. And that's when they can get very distressed very quickly, whether by the loud sounds, sudden noise, by the lighting, by all the commotion that's happening. And if we can understand that and respond to that in a way where we're still tuning into what they need to be soothed, to be calm, and to help them soothe themselves when they have a temper tantrum or a meltdown because they're so distressed, I think we can still respond in the same way. But it also takes a huge amount of that patience and the understanding from a parent of a child with special needs to understand what is it that my children loves so that I can help my child to soothe with a comfort toy or an activity that the child needs to be able to stay calm and to understand what triggers my child with special needs that makes my child so distressed so quickly. How can I work around that so that I'm reducing the distress of my child and then responding appropriately? But of course, sometimes our special needs children, sometimes they learn new things and they get distressed about new things. And it might take a parent by surprise. And we're learning all the time. So we respond and we really don't need to be 100% responsive, on the ball parent all the time. Give ourselves some space to make mistakes and then to learn from it, and then we move from there. It's okay.
Thank you. Some parents have provided very concrete examples of experiences they've had with their child. So I've got a parent who has a child who is 2 years, 9 months, and the parent says that the child is very picky with food. So the parent doesn't quite know how to handle the child. And there is another parent who has a 4-year-old child. And I think this child takes a bit of time to prepare for school. So two very specific examples from parents with young children. I'm wondering how they should practice sensitive caregiving in situations like this.
This is really common too. I just want to reassure the parent, yeah, our kids are so adorable. And at the same time, they've got their personality. So thinking about a 2-year, 9 months child who's picky about food, we all have our taste, right? We all have our preference. And also acknowledging that for our very young child. Now, you think about this child who's not even 3 yet. It's probably not a child who can articulate a lot of vocabulary and to tell you, wow, this one is very bitter. I don't like it. And so we probably have to put the vocabulary for them and to describe it and acknowledge, oh, does it taste funny? Does it taste sour? And then we kind of learn together with our child how to communicate that. And at the same time, introduce slowly some of the different foods. I think our enthusiasm as well does make a difference in the way that we introduce new foods, new tastes, new flavor to our children. I give an example. There was once when I was in a children's camp, and I was serving food to all these young children. And I've got a nurse who was standing next to me, and we go, okay, let's watch the reaction of the young children because there's a lot of vegetables here. And funnily enough, the way that the teachers who brought the children to our food, the teacher's reaction made a difference to what the children are going, how the children are going to respond. So one teacher said, "Oh, look, we have vegetables here. It's good for you." And then the children made a funny face. And then the other teacher came and said, "Wow, vegetables! Wow, I love them. They look so colorful. Look." And then the children got very curious and they were interested. So it's just the way that we introduce some of the food to them. We can keep trying and help them to experiment with it. That probably helps in the way that we're responding and helping them to regulate their response to new food. I thought I'll chat a little bit about the older child.
Yes.
Yeah, so with the older child, when they're thinking about preparing them, was the question about preparing them for school?
Yes. Yes, so the child is 4 years old, and I think the child has his own temperament and his own views. And the parents are rushing to work and they need to drop the child off to school first, and the child is taking his own time. So I think the parents are trying to understand, I'm trying to be a sensitive caregiver and respond to my child's cues. But I'm also very stressed because I have to go to work very soon after that. So how do I be a sensitive caregiver to my child, respect my child's cues, be responding to him, and yet having to work with my own constraints at the same time? So I think that's the parent's predicament.
And it's so real because for our 4-year-old, their world is not governed by time, right? For a 4-year-old, later, tomorrow, yesterday, like it's still a new construct to them. And when we're rushing them, they're not in a rushing world, and we are in a rushing world. So understanding where our 4-year-old's world is coming from, and to help our young child to think about, oh, those are some of the 5 things we need to do together to get to school. Let me help you. And position yourself in a way where you're getting through all these routines to get ready in a very positive environment, in a positive atmosphere, and helping our child understand mommy's here or daddy is here. We're going to get together, get ready together, and then we're going to walk to school together. And I'll let the child know what are some of the activities and routines of getting ready and what that means. And then have the child to look forward to something when we're either in a bus or in a car or walking to school. And to have that child understand that when we are going to school together, it's not a rush, it's not hurried, it's not I'm being stressed. Yes, we can walk fast. Yes, we can sing a song while we go, but we're creating the atmosphere where I'm still spending time with you. You're important to me. At the same time, let's do this together. And we hold our hand and then we walk to school together. So it's about how we facilitate that and ease the anxiety for our children, but also letting them understand these are the 5 things we need to do. Put on your socks, wear your shoes, and we're going to do this together and we enjoy our walk together. And once we achieve those 5 things, activities together, we have a longer walk that we can go together and we can sing 2 songs rather than 1 song together.
Sounds like fun. Listening to you say that, I feel like being a child again. Okay, I've got a few questions that deal with multiple caregivers, different parenting styles, different grandparenting styles. So we've got parents asking, how can I properly parent my child if I only see him twice a week and his main caregivers are his grandparents? That's one question. Another question, in a household where there are multiple caregivers and these multiple caregivers each have different parenting approaches and styles, which may at times be conflicting, how does the parent try to reconcile this and how might he help his or her child?
Yeah, that's so real in a household, right? When we have so many caregivers at the same time. I do think it is essential as well, just to have everybody on the same page and to communicate that. So let's say I'm a caregiver who may only be spending a huge amount of time over the weekend with my child because my child is being cared for by other caregivers. I do think I would want to spend that time with my child for bonding activities. I wouldn't come home and then be barking instructions at my child, why do you do this? Don't do that. And I would want to set up that positive atmosphere and also thinking about some of the connecting activities that I can do together, having my child sit on my lap and having walks together and connecting in that way. And that's okay. And that's okay with the 2 days per week, even when we're doing that. So I grew up as well with my auntie as my main caregiver, and I go back to my parents only during the weekends. But they made sure that we have good family time together. And we grow up to be strong and resilient anyway, because we have good caregivers all around 7 days of the week. Now, when we have caregivers who might have different style, some say you can eat candy, some say you can watch TV till you fall asleep, some say you can watch TV and do homework at the same time, and some say maybe you can't. But I think it's communication, I think, at the same time, and to communicate with, let's say, a spouse who differs in your parenting style and say, what do we want to be the best for our children? Maybe let's have a compromise and let's not confuse our child. And maybe come to a compromise and think about what's the best for our children's development. I think the worst that we can do is probably to tell our child, don't tell your mommy. I let you do this, don't tell your daddy. I think that's probably something we should avoid, but just be a bit more consistent in what we think is the best for our children.
Thank you, Cheryl. I'm mindful of the time, and we have to close the session by 9:15 because I think we've got busy parents with us online, and they may want to be taking care of their children and being a sensitive caregiver to them. So I'm just going to try to wrap by summarizing what I learned through tonight's webinar, and also to also check in with you, Dr. Cheryl, on some of the final and important points that you'd like to make. I think first and foremost, what I learned is that being a sensitive caregiver definitely has positive impacts and outcomes on the children, not only in terms of building their confidence, in terms of their emotional regulation and awareness. It encourages them to be more confident when exploring their surroundings and environment around them. They're more assured of having a trusted adult come to them if they're in distress. And it also helps in their cognitive development as well as language development. So all very good stuff for the children. And I think the research is pretty developed. And if our friends online would like to learn more, I think they can go on to Child's website, where you have your evidence insights available, and the parents can read them up and understand more about the research. At the same time, I think through your sharing tonight, I think parents have learned that regardless of situations, we should always try to make time to understand our children's cues, to recognize the patterns. And sometimes it might be just about, setting aside quality time, not just the amount of time, but making full use of the time that we have with them. And understanding their responses, their feedback, their cues during these important moments, and try to see it from the child's perspectives as well. That is what I learned from the session tonight. Dr. Cheryl, would you have some final points to share?
Yeah, that's really good summing up. And I thought I would just chime in and maybe the imagery of being a tennis player. I love playing tennis, and we think about our caregiving journey as a serve and return dialogue in a way. The way that we play tennis with our partner, we need to move, we need to adjust, and then we try to anticipate, and we want to keep the game going because we don't want it to stop. I think it's the same way when we think about engaging our children. We want it to be a two-way serve and return, where we're responding and where we're waiting and we're anticipating and understanding. So we can make an effort to be as responsive as possible. The key is as often as possible as we can. Now, keeping in mind that having these kind of strong social relationships are so essential to our children's ability to have very healthy social and emotional skills, to foster their brain development and to build their resilience to stress from young all the way till their teenage years. So the implications are very clear, very strong. Let's give ourselves a little bit of a slack. Sometimes we can't do it 100%, but let's do it as often as we can.
Thank you, Dr. Cheryl. I'm mindful that there were many questions that we did not manage to answer because of the time. But what we will try to do is that we will leave a post-event survey form open, and our participants can fill up the survey. They can leave their comments, and I think what myself and Dr. Cheryl can do is that we'll find other ways, whether through Facebook or Instagram. We'll try to answer your questions in a written format. We'll put them up. So we'll try our very best to answer as many questions as possible. And I'm glad that our parents have found tonight's session informative. So our next webinar is on 20th of September, Friday, 8:30 p.m. And we'll be discussing another hot topic that I know parents are concerned about. And that is screen time's influence on young minds. So I hope everyone will be able to join us for the next session. Until then, please leave us your comments and feedback. Thank you, Dr. Cheryl, and thank you to the Child team and the Sun Care team for co-organizing tonight's webinar. Thank you and good night.